Okay, so today's daf is Menachot daf Samech Zion 67. We are on Samech Vav Amabet. Let me share my screen and we will get fully started. So yesterday we saw the following machlokes in the Mishnah. The Chachamim say that the remainder of the barley flour left over after preparing the isaron of barley flour for the Omer offering is subject to challah, but not to meiser. Rabbi Akiva says no, it's subject to both challah and meiser. We explained that Rabbi Akiva holds his position because the Beis Hamikdash only acquired the barley flour used in the Omer. As a result, the leftover barley flour was never hektish, and therefore it's just like when you buy anything from somebody else. At the moment that it was smoothed out, the flour was the flour was smoothed out. That is when it's considered complete and subject to meiser. And at that moment, it was still subject to meiser because it was in private hands. It was owned by a person and not by Hektish. And so as a result, Rava told us that if one donated grain to the Beit Hamikdash, and the grain was smoothed while it was owned by the Beit Hamikdash, even Rabbi Akiva would agree that it is only subject to challah and not to meiser. And that's because the moment of being subject to challah is later than the moment of being subject to meiser. If the person were to then continue the process and start mixing, well, then presumably they would not be. And as we pick up with the second word on the 10th line of from the bottom of Samach Vav Amabet, Rava offers another teaching. So again, second word on the let's say second word on the 10th to the last line. So Meiruach Oved Kochavim. So what if an Oved Kochavim does the smoothing? So is that considered just like Hektish doing the smoothing, and therefore we're going to exclude it from the subject of Meiser? Or do we say no? It's of course the non-Jew himself does not need to take Meiser, but if a Jew were to buy it from him, because it was owned by a private individual, that's still considered like a Jew owned it at the relevant moment. When the Jew buys it, it's as if he owned it the entire time, and so as a result, he's still going to be subject to the obligation of Meiser. Tanaihi, and that is a machlokas Tanaim. Titania, because we have the brisa that details this machlokas. Tormin Mishal Yisrael, Al Shal Yisrael. You can take truma from a Jew's property for another Jew's property. You can umishal ovde kochavim, al shal ovde kochavim, and you can take produce from one idolater for another idolater in order to take meiser. Umishal kutim, al shal kutim, and similarly for kutim, you can do one on another. Umeshal, and here's the key line: umi shall kol, al shall kol, and all these three groups you can mix them together. Divri Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda. That's what Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda say. So, according to Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, you can take truma from and produce from any of these categories for any category. Now, that's not what Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon say. For Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, Omrim, Tormim Mishal Yisrael, 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 Mishal Avdei Kochavim, Al Shal Kutim, Umishal Kutim Al Shal Ovdei Kochavim, Aval Lo Mishal Yisrael Al Shal Ovdei Kochavim, V'Shal Kutim, V'Lo Mishal Ovdei Kochavim, V'Shal Kutim Al Yisrael. So Al Shal Yisrael. So the bottom line is that although the Kutim and the Ovdei Kochavim are considered one group, non-Jews and Kutim are considered one group because the Kutim are not considered effectively full-fledged Jews because their conversion wasn't necessarily sufficient. And so as a result, they are all considered like non-Jews, and they can be Tomrin one on the other. But when it comes to Jews in either of those other groups, you can't do from one to the other. And so that highlights, so the point is that according to the first group, if a non-Jew does the smoothing and then a Jew buys the grain, buys the flour, well then that Jew knows that no truma and maasros have ever been taken, and so you're going to have to take trumas and maasros from it. And on the other hand, and the second group, on the other hand, the second group, Yossi and Rabbi Shimon would say, of course not. There's no requirement for a non-Jew to take trumas and maasros. Oh, maybe you'll say that maybe there is. Well, that we'll see that that's just going to be a rabbinic. Meaning, why does it say that the Kutim and the non-Jews can take one for the other? The point is that that is a rabbinic requirement, and we will see the reason for that rabbinic requirement shortly. So now that we have this concept, and remember, we had the question in our Mishnah of do we treat Trumas and Maasros as similar to Challah? So now Rava asks the following. Rava teaches one more rule. So with respect
If
to
the non-Jew works for the Jew or the non-Jew rents from the Jew, these arrangements, is the non-Jew taking? Can he take
most
the challah for as an agent of the Jew?
So yes, it's an excellent question. So there are a couple issues that you raise in your question. The first question is, what if the non-Jew does the smoothing and he doesn't own the flour? So most of the Rishonim understand this Gemara as talking about ownership and not, and that's how I've translated, and not the act itself of smoothing. So that's point number one. Point number two is that there is a very interesting debate. I believe that we end up paskening ein shlichus akum, that you cannot use a non-Jew as a messenger for a halachic purpose. But there is, so in general, we say that you can't. And there is I believe the Gemara itself contains a debate about whether a non-Jew's if a non-Jew does it for a Jew, even if they're not a shliach of the Jew, so does the act itself have meaning? And that could be separate from the concept of shliach. And I believe that there is a debate about that issue in the Gemara. So I'm not like fully up on the halachot of Trumas and Maasros, my apologies, but that's my understanding of the issues raised by your question. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the step that's key for making challah, and that's gilgul. That's mixing the dough. So gilgul hektish poter. If you do the mixing of the dough and the dough belongs to hektish, you're exempt from challah. Ditnan, how do I know? Hektisha isasa ad shalo gilgala. If she makes it hektish before she mixes it, ufadata, and then she redeems it before she mixes it, chayevet, then she's going to be obligated in challah. So even though it was owned by hektish for a moment, it's still, because when she redeemed it, it still had not yet been mixed, it's still going to be subject to challah. Mishagilgala ufadata chayevet. And even if she, and of course, if she mixed it and then donated it to Hektish, and then redeemed it, again, it's going to be chayevet. She's going to be subject to challah because because she owned it personally when she mixed it. So one case she mixed it after she redeemed it. One case she mixed it before she consecrated it. But in both cases, she owned it. But hektisha ad shelo gilgala, if she made it hektish before she mixed it, the gilgala hagizbar, and now the treasurer mixes it, va'achakak pedata, and then she redeems it, pitura, it is exempt. shebishas chovata haita pitura, because at the moment that the obligation would have ordinarily kicked in, meaning when she did the when the mixing was happening, that at that moment it was exempt because it was owned by the Beis Hamikdash. So now mixing these teachings by Rava, Rava says the following: Gilgal Ovid Kochav Mai. So do we say the same rule in connection with the mixing of the challah by a non-Jew and say that it's not obligated to challah because it's mixed by a non-Jew? Or do we say no? So, Mishnah Tanan, we learned in a Mishnah, Gershon is Gayer. Here we have a somebody who is converting to Judaism, V'haisalo Isa, and he already had some dough. Nasa achalonis gayer. If he made the dough before he converted putter, well, then of course it's exempt because it was made into dough, meaning he did the mixing while he was a non-Jew, and therefore it's not going to be subject to challah. Mission is gayer chayah. But once he does the conversion and he does the mixing, well, then he's going to be obligated in challah. Suffolk, if he's unsure what he did, chayav, we're going to say that he's obligated. So Haman Ketanila, who is the author of this Mishnah? So do we say Divri Hakol? So there are two possibilities. Maybe it's all four opinions, meaning it's both the couple of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda and the pairing of Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon, and everybody is saying, but afilu Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda to come a chayvi hasam, that even though when it comes to truma, they say that that a non-Jew is obligated in truma. Pitri haka, they might say that here there is an exemption. Why is there an obligation over there? Hassam, who there's an obligation. Dixiv, I actually said that it was a rabbinic institution, but I'm wrong. I forgot which case we're talking about. No, it would actually be a biblical obligation. Dixiv, degancha, degancha. It says degancha actually three times in the Torah, and Rashi helps us understand what it's trying to say. So let's take a look at Rashi Hassam, 1, 2, 3, 6 lines down in the narrow lines of Rashi on Samach Zayin Omid Aleph. Hainu Taima. Here's the reason that when it comes to Meiser, you would be obligated even if the person was not a Jew. Here's the reason that when a non-Jew does the smoothing, he is not exempt. Mishum de trade the gancha ksivi. There are actually, if you take a look at the Masoras Hashas, it changes it to tlasa. So you should actually look at that word. So the tlasa de gancha ksivi. There are three written times of referencing de gancha. And the first is Diksiv in Dvarim Yud Bet, Lo tuchal la'echol bish'arecha ma'aser digancha, right? So that's number 1. Viksiv v'achalta lifnei, I think it's Hashem, ma'aser digancha. That's in Shmot Yud Dalid. Viksiv in Shmot Yud Chet, Reshis Digan, Dvarim Yudalid, and then in Dvarim Yudchet it says Reshis Digancha again to indicate the requirement to take Meiser. So
the Parsha Re'eh? I think it's Parsha Re'eh, right?
At least one of them I think is Parshas Re'eh.
Right.
Okay. Chad lemelef diguncha below digun hektish. So the first one comes to teach us that you do. That you have to take Meiser on your grain, but not the grain that belongs to Hektish. And so as a result, and take a look at letter Tet in the Shita Mikubetzes, Kilomar, he adds, Meiruach Hektish, that meaning that when you smooth out Hektish, that is not going to be subject to the obligation of
Meiser.
So Aitor lahu. So that leaves over Trey Degancha. Now we have 2 more Deganchas. And what could they be used for? Lema'et Digun Ovid Kochavim. Well, that means that we have 2 in order to exclude 1 item. So have digun oved kochavim miyud achar miyud. So we end up with digancha two times, and that creates. Oh, so now let's go an exclusion after an exclusion. To tray crime atile, because we have two verses that are available to exclude it. So back into the
So we're
Gemara.
saying that the non-Jew that would be putter or not putter. I'm confused
No,
here.
the non-Jew would be obligated
But
in.
didn't you give me a drasha a little while ago, or telling from that the non-Jew would not be? Didn't I?
The non-Jew himself is not obligated. The question is what happens if a Jew buys it from the non-Jew? And so what we're saying is that the non-Jew is that the non-Jew's grain is subject to the obligation. Okay, so now let's take a look. We're now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 7, 8, 9,
So he
10.
did this
Oh,
before he sold it. Is that what the non-Jew? He
yes, he did the smoothing of the flour before he sold it, and the question is okay, well, he already made it, when he finished the product, the finished product being the smoothen flour, the smooth flour. So now the question is when a Jew buys it, is it subject to Trumas and Maasros? And according to again, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, the answer is yes. And so
Well, we
why?
didn't we just learn about the woman that if she smoothed it, but when it was part of hectic, she got to
No,
really
you're remembering. We learned about mixing in connection with challah. That's
right.
the situation. So you have to make
Uh,
sure you distinguish between the mixing for challah and the smoothing for trumas and maestros. So that's a key difference. And so the point is that when it comes to the both the ger and the woman. So then clearly, when it comes to the mitzvah of challah, somebody is saying you're not obligated. And now the question that we had is, was that everybody? And therefore, when Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda say it, they're noting that they would change their mind. And while, with respect to Meiser, the actions of the non Jew do not exempt the flour from Trumas and Maisros, but when it comes to Challah, the actions of the non Jew would exempt it from Challah. And so now back into the Gemara, the word Yisera, third last to last word on the line, and it's the 11th line down. Yisera Havi. So we end up with an extra I'm sorry, Yisera. And so Havi Miut Akar Miut. And so as a result, there's an extra learning, an extra limitation, because Digancha is a limitation because it suggests yours and not someone else's. And so as a result, the ain miut akar miut elul rabos. And the whole reason that we have that the Torah would teach us two exclusions, one after the other, is to include. And so as a result, because the next thing we were going to exclude is the case of Ovdei Kochavim, we're going to say Afilu Ovdei Kochavim. That is the basis for Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda saying earlier the fact that when it comes to non-Jew doing Meireach, it's going to not exempt them because the Torah has specifically included them through the usage of an extra digancha. Aval hacha. But here, what would Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda say? They would note, Trezim ne aruse sechem ksiv. The word ariso sechem, your dough, is written twice. Chad ariso sechem kedei isaschem. One time it tells us how much dough you need to have. It needs to be as large as the dough, and the drasha is effectively that you need as much as you would get in the man, and so that's how much dough you need to have in order to be obligated in challah. And the second repetition is to tell you that it's your dough that is subject to challah, but not the dough that belongs to a non-Jew or to the Beit Hamikdash. And so, as a result, now I will note that Tosfos and the Shita Mekubetzes have a different version of the text, which addresses one of the concerns that you might have, because you might say, well, I don't understand. When it came to Digancha, we used one Digancha for Hektish and one Digancha for Ovdei Kochavim, and now you want to use one Arisosechem to teach us both Ovdei Kochavim and Isas Hektish. And so as a result, they have a language of Chad Arisosechem below Isas Ovdei Kochavim. So one goes to the non-Jews, Chad Arisosechem below Isas Hektish. So basically you could do the same thing, except that when it came to Degancha, we had three, so we had an extra one, so we included idolaters. And now when it came to Arisosechem, we only have two, so we exclude both the Hektish and the idolaters. So that's one possible thing. Meaning we could say that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda would say something different between the situation of Chala and the situation of Meiser. That when it comes to Meiser, a non-Jew's action is going to exempt you, but when it comes to Chala, a non-Jew's action is not going to exempt you. O Dilma, or maybe we could say that no, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon Katanila, when we saw that Mishnah that we just quoted a few moments ago, that noted that a non-Jew who works their dough into their flour into a dough before they convert, that it's not subject to challah. And who is that? Maybe that is only Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Dekapatri, because they're the ones who exempt with respect to taking trumas and maasros, and so they'll say the same thing with respect to challah. Aval Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, Gamri Rashis Mahasam. Maybe they make a Gzeira Shava, and they say, just as Rashis is said in connection with tithing, so too Rashis is said in connection with Chala. And so as a result, we'll learn from tithing, where we say that even the actions, the final actions of a non-Jew do not exempt you from tithing, so too the final actions of a non-Jew will not exempt you from challah. So that's the question. As Rashi tells us, Rashis, about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 lines down in the Rashi, in the narrow lines of Rashi. Probably smack in the middle, I should have just said. Rashis digancha, Rashis hariso sechem. So one time it says Rashis digancha, that's in Dvarim, Perek Yud Chet Pasuk Dalid, and one time it says Rashis hariso sechem. That's in Parsha Shlach, in Bamidbar Perek Tesvav. Pasuk, both Kaf and Kaf Aleph have it, but it doesn't make it. So it's one of those two, and that's where we're going to learn it from. So Mala Halan Meruach Ove Kochavim Lo Patar Demar Binan La Mimiud Achar Miud. That after all, when it came to smoothing out, we say the smoothing of a non-Jew does not exempt one, because we have the Miud Achar Miud learning in connection with the word Digancha. So Af Gilgol, so too when it comes to mixing Oved Kochavim by a non-Jew, Eino Poter, we're going to say that that's not going to exempt one as well. So that's the question. The question is, does the machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi on the one hand, and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon on the other hand, does that machlokas also apply to which is a machlokas in connection with Meiser? Does that machlokas also apply to Chala? Okay, and Amar Rava now says, Yehei Rava, it should be the will of God, the echazei bechelma, that I should see it in a dream. Hadar Amar Rava. Later Rava said, now it's not clear actually. Was this the fact that Rava is about to give us an answer? Is that because he saw the logic in a dream? Or was the fact that he was asking for Hashem's help an indication that Hashem would give him the help? So in any event, bottom line is Rava figures it out and says the following: Manda Amar Me Ruach Kochavim Poter. Gilgal Kochavim Poter. Manda Amar Me Ruach Kochavim Eino Poter. Gilgal Kochavim Eino Poter. He says, you know what? It's the same machlokas. If you say that it's exempt when it comes to Meiser, you're going to say it's exempt when it comes to Chala, when an Oved Kochavim does the action, does the final action. But if you say that it's not exempt, namely Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda who say it's not exempt, they would also say that it's not exempt when it comes to Chala as well. So bottom line
we're
is
talking about a case where the Jew bought it. right? After the non-Jew did the sacrifice.
Absolutely. We're talking about at the end of the day, a Jew needs to own it because if a non Jew just owns it the entire time, certainly that non Jew is not obligated in Trumas and Maasros or in Chala. That is not one of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. And so we're just talking about,
Right.
again, this is how most authorities understand this. And I believe that's how we paskin this Gemara.
So
That in
why
fact,
could it not be then that that the Jew could send his non-Jew to do this, his worker to do this for him, and
and create
while
an
the Jew
exemption.
owns it, the Jew owns it, and he says that not.
Well, if so, again, according to most authorities, if the Jew sends the non-Jew to do it, to do, let's say, the mixing, he's still going to be subject to challah. That's not enough to, you can't operate a bakery. Certainly,
Right.
no hashgacha will allow you to operate a bakery. Say you're going to have non-Jews do all the mixing of the bread and thereby not have to take any challah. That is not an accurate statement of the halacha as we paskin it. Now, there are some authorities that do say that in fact that would be the halacha. Again, we don't paskin like those authorities, but you can understand why they say that because the Gemara seems to focus on the action, not the ownership. So
Right.
that's the reason that they say that. But again, we understand this Gemara as primarily related to the ownership issue.
And that occurs for both the challah and the maaser.
And Lamasa, we would paskin that way, both for challah and for trumas and maestros. That's my understanding. So Esvei. So now we're going to ask a question because Rav Papa LaRava. Rav Papa says to Rava, 1 second. Ovid Kochavim, listen to the following rule. Ovid Kochavim Shehifrish Peter Chamor, if a non-Jew has a firstborn donkey and he's hifrish, and Rashi tells us it's the next Rashi back into Rashi. So now from the bottom of the Rashi, it's about 17 lines up. Shehifrish Peter Chamor, Shehifrish Sel Pigeon Peter Chamor. That what's the process of redeeming a firstborn donkey? You take a sheep and you put it in its place. Shenolad lo biyoto ovid kochavim. And the point is that this non-Jew had a firstborn donkey, and now he separates a sheep, v'chala, or he separates chala. Modiim lo. You know what we do? We tell him what happens. Shehu patur. He's exempt from these mitzvot. V'chalato nechelet zarim. And therefore, the chala can be eaten by a non-Kohen. Upeter chamor gozes ve'ovebo, and that firstborn donkey, you can shear it, you could work with it. There's no kedusha for it. But what is the implication of this? What wasn't mentioned in this brisa? Truma. So the Gemara says, ha truma so asura, must be that you could derive from this that his truma would be forbidden. Meaning, if the non-Jew were to actually take truma, we would not allow a non-Kohen to eat it. Vaha Hi Tana de Amar Meruach Ha'ovid Kochavim Eino Poter. But 1 second, this is somebody who says that when it comes to the smoothing of the grain by an idolater, it's not exempt from tithing because, after all, that isn't. That's exactly the derivation that we just said that truma would be obligated. The Gilgal Ovid Kochavim Poter, and yet this person is saying that this same person is saying that it's exempt. So doesn't this brisa have to reflect the positions of Rebbe Meir and Rebbe Yehuda? And therefore, isn't that a contradiction to you, Rava? And so isn't that right? And so that's the question. Va'od, and you know what? Isve Ravina LaRava. Ravina asked a question on Rava's explanation from a similar kind of perspective. When we have a brisa that says chalas ovid kochavim ba'aretz, if a non-Jew takes chala in Israel, utruma so b'chutz la'aretz, or he takes truma outside of Israel, modiano so shehupa tor. We tell him that he is exempt and that chalatone achelet luzarim. His challah can be eaten by non-kohanim. Utruma so eina modamat, and his truma doesn't in a mixture doesn't create a problem. So ha truma so ba'aretz asura. What is not mentioned here? What's not mentioned is truma in the land of Israel. The implication is that that truma would create a prohibition, umidamaat, and it would create a mixture. That would be a problem. So vaha hai tana da amar meruach haobi kochavim eno poter. So here we see that this is somebody who clearly says that the smoothing by an idolater does not exempt from tithing, and yet gilgal haobi kochavim poter. And yet the mixing does exempt the person from challah. So, and again, that who is it that says that smoothing doesn't exempt from tithing? That's Rebbe Meir and Rebbe Yehuda. So clearly, Rebbe Meir and Rebbe Yehuda do not say that when it comes to both challah and truma and maestros, that you would say that the actions of a non-Jew will not create an exemption, because this brisa itself says that there's an exemption for challah, that challah doesn't apply to the non-Jew. So Rabba, doesn't that show you that you're wrong, and that in fact everybody agrees that when it comes to challah, the actions of an idolater will exempt the dough from challah? So no, not necessarily. You know what we could do? We could say it is actually who is the author of these brisas? The author of these brisas is Rebbe Yossi and Rebbe Shimon, who say that actually the actions of a non-Jew, both with respect to challah and with respect to trumas and maestros, are always going to exempt. And why is it that we could imply in these brisas that actually the truma and maestros taken by a non-Jew would be subject to being treated as trumas and maestros? Midirabanan. It's because they would agree that it's rabbinic. So, and why would they do it? So here, take a look at Midirabanan, second to last line in the narrow lines of Rashi on Samach Zayin Amud Aleph. Kolomar la'olam hadiktani legabi chala gilgal poter hanach tanaihi de patri le'el de b'meiruach. That when we say these two brisas, and it says that they're exempt with respect to chala, it's the authors of the earlier that the two parties in the earlier brisa that said that in fact it's a that when you do meruach by a non-Jew, it's going to exempt them. So why then do these two brisas that we just cited, that Rav Papa and Ravina cited, why did they say that you're obligated, that it's treated as usser? V'hadikatani. La'el medukya ha trumaso asura, and that which we learned in the brisas just a moment ago, that you could derive from it that their truma of a non-Jew is usher, midarabanan habi usher. It is only a rabbinic prohibition. And so that's the story. So it's only a rabbinic prohibition. And so why is it a rabbinic prohibition? So gzeira mishum bali kisim. It's a gzeira because of people with pocketbooks, people with money, with change purses. So what does that mean? So Rashi offers us two explanations.
Now, isn't the challah, isn't, first of all, isn't truma always forbidden to a non-Kohen?
Well, the question is,
So why are we
if
making a
it's
distinction?
truly truma, you're absolutely right. But here we're talking about truma that was taken by a non-Jew, and of course, and Rebbe. I'm sorry that I keep scrolling because
So
I
if
can't
he's
remember the
taking
name.
the truma, what are we saying, that that it's not a valid taking of the truma?
That's what Rebbe Yossi and Rebbe Shimon would
So
say.
so I mean, truma is always asur to a non-Jew, right? So
No,
what
no,
we
no, no,
can
no,
make
no, 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 no.
that then
Again,
always asur to a non-Kohen.
it is if it's really truma, but here it's a non-Jew who took it. And Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon say that if the non-Jew owns the grain at the time, owns the flour at the time it was smoothed, well, then it's not subject to truma at all. And so, from a biblical perspective, it is not in fact truma. And so, as a result, that's what Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon say. But they would then add, but we're going to treat it as truma and make it prohibited rabbinically. That's the point.
Prohibit to whom? Everybody?
Prohibited to a non-Jew, to a, excuse me, prohibited to a non-Kohen. He would
And,
say the truma is prohibited to a non-Kohen,
but if it's
even though it's
owned by
not really truma,
but if
even though
it's
it's
owned right, but if it's owned by a non-Jew takes it, whatever. Then if it's we consider it as if he took truma and it's prohibited to the non-Kohen, is it now permitted to the Kohen?
yes, yes, it would be permitted to a Kohen. It would be
Even
treated
though it wasn't
rabbinically.
owned by by a Jew, and it's not, maybe it's not really truma.
That's right.
Could the Kohen eat it?
Of course, absolutely. A Kohen, because look, if it's actually truma, the Kohen can eat it, and if it's not truma, the Kohen can eat it. So the Kohen can eat it. That's not a problem. The Kohen
Uh,
being able to eat is not a problem. But so the Gemara says, why is it that we're going to make this decree? Meaning, if in fact, I wish I could remember things in my life. If in fact Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon really believe that this is that when a non-Jew does the smoothing, that in fact it is no longer subject to trumas and maasros. So then, even when they take truma, it should still be subject to. It should not be subject to trumas and maasros, and the truma shouldn't be truma, and therefore anybody should eat it. So why are you trying to say that it is subject to the limitations of truma, and therefore that only a Kohen can eat it? So let's take a look at Rashi. Gzeira mishum bale kisin, second wide line, end of the line. Gzeira mishum bale kisin. Ashirim, rich people, Shalochin Tavua, Michamarim, that they buy it from the marketers, from the middlemen. The Isha Rita Lulo Keach, Minha Ovikochavim, and if you then permit them to buy it from non-Jews, Shaloya Aser, and you say that they don't have to take Trumas and Maestros because the non-Jew has smoothed it out, and because the smoothing by a non-Jew exempts it, Nami Yisrael Poter. They might come to make a mistake and say, hey, what is it that allows me to not have to worry about Trumas and Maestros? It's because I bought a finished product. So too, when I buy a finished product from a Jewish middleman, it will be okay for me to not have to take Trumas and Maestros. That's argument number one, that they might come to make a mistake in that way. Lishna achrina, or alternatively, mishum bale kisin. What does it mean when we say because of the wealthy? Sheyesh lehen karkaos harbe. We're talking about people who've got a lot of land. The chasim al rov maestros, and they'll be concerned about having to pay such significant trumas and maestros taxes. V'yaknuhu la'ovdei kochavim, and then they'll transfer it to a non-Jew, v'yamrichum ovdei kochavim, and they'll have the non-Jew do the smoothing, umafkei mimaser, and you'll end up exempting it from Meiser. So either it's because we're worried they're going to make a mistake and not take Trumas and Meisers when they're obligated, or they're going to use this as a harama to try and trick the Kohanim out of their fair share. But the bottom line is that's why we're concerned about this, and that's why the rabbis would make a decree to say, you know what, you cannot that even when you have trumas and maestros that are taken by a non-Jew, or in any event, or if you have property of a grain of a non-Jew, a flour of a non-Jew that has been smoothed, and we're still going to tell you that you have to take trumas and maestros, at least in the land of Israel.
Well,
So
that sounds like almost like the discussion we had earlier with the Beit HaMikdash. Person gives it donates it, and then and the smoothing or the mixing, whatever is done by the Beit HaMikdash, then it's when it's podet and he's patur, right? So
correct,
why couldn't the same thing happen here? The same thing, you
correct.
give it to the non-Jew, or you can makdish it to hektish to the
So
Beit
so
HaMikdash and then take it back.
So excellent question. So two things. Two thoughts about that. First of all, if you do that, when you redeem it for yourself, you have to pay an extra 1/5. So 1/5 is more than 1/10. And so as a result, you'll be better off just doing the trumas and maestros and not having to pay the extra penalty of 1/5, which is of course 1/4 really. So you would actually end up paying more. So there's no point in it. You would not do the harama to donate it to the hektish and then try and redeem it from hektish. So that wouldn't work with respect to hektish. That's point number one. Point number two is that yeah. So I think that that's probably a sufficient answer as to why we will still allow. You're absolutely right. When it comes to hektish, everybody agrees that the smoothing is not going. That once it's smoothed by the people of hektish, it's not going to be subject to trumas and maestros. That's exactly right. But when it comes to a non-Jew, we have a machlokes, and even the people who say that it's not subject to trumas and maestros say that rabbinically we make it subject to trumas and maestros. Okay, so that's the discussion exactly how you highlighted it. That in fact you're right that when it comes to hektish it's exempt, but not when it comes to a non-Jew. Even though, even according to the opinion that says that really biblically it should be exempt, we're going to treat it as not exempt.
But with Hectus, you did say that there's a fine if he takes it back.
Yeah, well, that correct, but that's it's not a fine on that. It's just the idea of if you redeem the item that you donated to Hektish, then you have an obligation to pay an extra premium to the price. If it gets redeemed by somebody else, well, then you're fine. If the whole point is to try and find this mechanism to get out of it, well, then that would be that mechanism would work. And frankly, what you could do, right? If you but again, it becomes much more complicated. That what you could do is the following: if you donate it to Hektish, you have your neighbor buy it back at value, and then you buy it from your
Yeah,
neighbor
yeah.
for $1 extra, and and
Right,
thereby you've effectively done it.
right, right.
So there is a way that you can do it. It's just going to take more work, and we're going to get to why we're not worried about that in just a moment.
Okay.
But one second, when it comes to challah, maybe we should be worried about that as well. So Efsher da'afila pachos mechameshes rivoim kemach va'od. Because after all, when it comes to challah, you could just avoid doing the proper amount, and you make challah in small batches, and then you're never subject to the mitzvah of challah. That's why we have challah bakes where people come together, because ordinarily an individual might not bake that much challah. So Truma Nami. Well, one second, when it comes to Truma too, there's a mechanism to avoid it. So if you're going to tell me that the reason that we're not concerned about Chala and we don't make a similar decree with respect to Chala is because there's an easy way around it. And so as a result, we're not worried that, we're not going to then say that we're worried about you using this as a way to trick the Kohanim out of their challah. So why don't we say the same thing about truma? Because Eser de Avila could Rabbi Oshia. You could do what Rabbi Oshia says. The Amar Rabbi Oshia Ma'arim Adam al Tvuaso. A person can be tricky with respect to their grain. Umachnisa bamot shala, and bring it into the house with the chaff. Kadesha dehebehem to'ocheles, in order for their animal to eat. Ufatur min amaser, and then you'll never be subject to meiser, because in the house already you then remove the chaff, and now it's going to be fine. It's already past the point that it's not subject to trumas and maestros.
Why is that?
Because
What?
because the only time that you're subject to trumas and maestros is when you bring it in its finished form in through the main door. And we're going to get another way that you could trick trumas and maestros. Inami de ayalo deragagos, videra carpaphos. If you bring it in through the roof or through the storage yard. I believe that even if you bring it in through a window, it would work. The bottom line is you need to bring it in an ordinary mechanism. And if you don't bring it in the ordinary way into your house, it is going to be okay. And you don't have any obligation of trumas and maestros. So isn't there, so now that we've identified ways to avoid both challah and trumas and maestros, why bother with this? Meaning, the reason that we said that we don't allow the person who's non-Jewish, that if you buy them non-Jews flour, that we don't allow you to avoid trumas and maestros, is because we're concerned that you're going to use the non-Jew as a mechanism to avoid trumas and maestros. But there are other mechanisms you could use, and so why not involve that? Do them? Well, hasam b'farhesia. No, The issue is that those other methods, bringing all of your produce in its non-finished form, everybody will see you do that. Similarly, if you bring it in through your window or your backyard, or you bring it in an abnormal way, everybody will see that, and you're going to be zila be milsa. It will be embarrassing, and so we're not worried about an avoidance method. Meaning, we're not worried about an avoidance method that requires you to be embarrassed, because Jews are subject to embarrassment, meaning one of the qualities of being a Jew is the fact that you have a sense of shame. And so as a result, you wouldn't do that. And so as a result, that's why we're also going to prohibit you to do this kind of sale to a non-Jew in order to avoid the mitzvah of Trumas and Maasros. But when it comes to challah, but hacha betzina, the challah mechanism you could do in private. So lo zila b'milsa, there is no embarrassment associated with that, and as a result, because there's no embarrassment, and yet there is an easy way around it. There's no point to having a rabbinic decree in that situation, because there's an easy way around it. So as a result, when it comes to challah, we do not have a rabbinic decree. We don't have a gzeira because there's an easy way around it that doesn't involve any embarrassment. But when it comes to trumas and maestros, we do make a gzeira. And yes, there is a way that you could get around it anyway and avoid the entire gzeira. That we're not so worried about, because it requires you to do something that is very unusual, very public, and as a result, we're not worried that you're going to use that mechanism to get around the process.
So when there's no gezerah on the challah, that means what? That there's no, what
That
was it?
if in
It's
fact
butter?
that if in fact a non-Jew were to do the mixing when the non-Jew owns the dough, then for sure there's no mitzvah of challah, and you don't have to worry about challah. And that's why if you were to when you buy bread that was owned by a company that was owned by a non-Jew, even though it has a hashgacha, I don't believe any trumas and maasros, any challah was ever taken from that bread, because you didn't need to, because it was owned by a non-Jew. And so
Uh,
as a result, that's exactly there. That's exactly right. And then,
but
we don't make a gzeira that you have to take that challah. That's exactly right.
I see. And we focused on the coin and the challah, but challah applies to everybody, doesn't it?
No, challah applies to everybody, but it goes to the Kohen.
Oh, you get that
Oh,
goes to the challah.
exactly.
I'm just there's just a point. I'm curious. The Gemara, in many cases, where it talks about a ger or ovid kachavim or isha, often the Gemara then talks about a katan, charesh, and shoteh. It doesn't mention those in this whole discussion. Is there?
It's a good question.
It
I think
talks
that
about mitzvot and obligations. It brings the
yeah.
katan, charesh,
I
v'shoteh.
think that they don't have the obligation directly, but I think that they would certainly be considered a Jew in terms of the ownership question. So if a Katan Cherish or Shota were to own the challah at the time it was mixed, or own the grain at the time that the flour was smooth, I believe that they would still be subject to Trumas and Maestros, and that's possibly why not, but it could be that they're just not discussed here. But you raise a good question as to the fact that they're not discussing all situations. We don't actually discuss the situation of it being, I guess there was that one case of the woman and Hektish, where it talked about the woman doing the
Right.
kneading, but there wasn't really a discussion of women here either. So I would suggest that maybe that's really the reason that they don't go into it, because it doesn't explicitly talk about the obligation being on women as well. Okay, so let's take a look at the next Mishnah, and with that, we'll then conclude. So, having prepared an isaron of barley flour in the last Mishnah, this Mishnah continues the process. So, what has happened? Below the isaron, he comes to the isaron, And what does he do? Nasan, take out the word alav. That's based on the Shita Mikubetzes, that he's not putting the oil on the flour, but rather first is Nasan Shamno Ulvonaso. He puts the oil into an empty kli, and that's the first application of oil. Yatsaku balal. Then he pours more oil and mixes the flour and oil. And Tosos here notes that actually these are two different steps. That in fact there are three times that you put in oil. You put in oil before into the container before the flour is added. You put the in oil after the flour is added in order to make it a mixture. And then you put oil in. The yatsak is actually the last of them. And you put the oil on top in order to have a shine on top. So Hanif, then you wave it, Vihigish, and you bring it close to the altar. As we saw, that means to bring it to the southwest corner. Kamatz v'hiktir. You then do the kamitza and you burn the komates with the lavona on the altar. V'hashar nechal kohanim. And of course, remember we take off the lavona in order to do the kamitza, and then we put the lavona back on when we after the komets, and we do the komets with the we put the komets into another kli that we already saw before in this Masechet, and then you put the lavona back on the komets, and now you put it all into the onto the altar, and it burns. And the rest gets eaten by the kohanim. And again, the tosos that if you want to see it is the tosos yatzak. It's the third to last tosos on the daf. Okay, Mishikarav HaOmer, when you once the Omer was offered, Yotzin Umotzin Shuk Yerushalayim Shehu Malay Kemach Kali. And you know what? It would be a miracle. When you came out after the Omer was offered, suddenly the marketplace would be filled with lots of flour flour and oven dried grains. So and Shalo Birtzon Chachamim Divrei Rebbe Meir. And Rebbe Meir says that wasn't what the rabbis wanted, because the rabbis, as Rashi says, Shalo Birtzon Chachamim, second line in the wide lines at the bottom of Rashi, De Gazrinan, because the rabbis would have made a gezerah, Shema Yochal. Maybe you'll come and eat when you're making the flour, you'll come and eat some. Kisha yiktzor, when you're doing the reaping, when you're doing the harvesting. V'yochal chadash, and you'll end up eating chadash. Kodam ha'omer, before the omer was offered. V'zeh shekvar hu kemach, and given the fact that it's already flour, vaday niktzar kodam ha'omer. It clearly must have been cut prior to the bringing of the omer. And so as a result, that's Rebbe Meir's opinion. Back into the Gemara,
Why
back into
isn't
the
it
Mishnah,
Yashan?
excuse me.
If it's done before the Omer, it's Yashan. It's Yashan, isn't it?
No, it's from the new crop. It's from the new crop, and so it's not. It's chadash. It's if it was done from last year, it would be yashan. But if it's from the new crop, it's chadash until the omer is brought.
Oh, right.
Rabbi Yehuda Omer and Rabbi Akin to the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, beratzon chachamim hayosim. No, the chachamim wanted it happen. As Rashi says, the lo gazar shema yochel. There was no gzera about maybe eating. That's not the concern. And so as a result, we're now going to begin. The Gemara is going to begin by asking the question, hey, you just said that Rabbi Yehuda is not going to make a gzera, that maybe we're going to eat something. But you know where he does make such a gzera? He makes such a gzera in connection with chametz. And so we're going to pick up with what is number 3 on our screen, God willing, tomorrow. And I wish everyone a wonderful day.
At what point does this become Yashan and not Chadash?
As soon as the Omer is offered.
Right, but the grain has been collected before, right? Before the Omer's offered, there has to be, right?
Well, no,
They've
no.
cut it.
So let's clarify whether what you're exactly referring to. There is the grain that is cut in order to produce the Omer.
Right.
So that grain certainly has to be cut before you could offer the Omer, because we're going to turn that grain into a coarse flour of barley, and that's going to be offered. But there is, of course, all the other grain that is standing in the field. And the point is that after the Omer was offered, people would walk out of the Beis Hamikdash and find marketplaces filled with flour from the new crop. So the question is that a good thing or a bad thing? So according to Rebbe Meir, it's a bad thing because the rabbis don't want you to do anything with that new crop until after the Omer because we're worried that you're going to accidentally take some to eat it and then you'll have violated Chodesh. But according to Rebbe Yehuda, no, we're not worried. And we will see why Rebbe Yehuda is not worried, why it's different from the case of Chametz, where he is worried, and God willing, tomorrow.
But all that flour is in the marketplace, right?
Yes, all the flowers in the marketplace.
But
And
is that flour? I mean, it got the
again,
is
it's
that flour from
chadash.
Yashan?
It's chadash until the omer is offered, and anybody who eats it is going to be violating chadash.
Right.
But as soon as the omer is offered, now it magically becomes yashan.
But that flour was from the previous year, right?
No, no. The whole point is the flour was cut just a week ago. Meaning the grain that is used for the Omer, it's the first grain, but the
Right.
point is that it's the first grain of this particular field. It's the first grain, but the bottom line is there are lots of fields all over Israel, and so people are going to start reaping the grain or harvesting the grain earlier, so that they can immediately have, as soon as the Omer is brought, have something to sell in the marketplace. That's going to be the best stuff. It's going to be super fresh. It's going to be really wonderful, and you're going to get the premium, presumably the premium price. So everybody wants to be the first in the market.
I understand. So, they bring the Omer on the 16th day of Nisan, right?
Yep.
Okay. So my question really is, what is the timeline? What is the date that before which or after which we would consider something yashan or chadash? That zotomerit that
Yeah.
they can harvest it. Can they harvest this grain in I don't know, in December, whatever the Kislev, or do they have to harvest the grain in Adar? Is there a date before which they can harvest it and allow that to be then brought to the market and sit in the marketplace
So I'm
until
not
the
perfectly.
16th? Or
I'm
is
not
there, or do they, let's say the brain was in their storehouse for 2 years, they brought it to the marketplace. What is the date before which we could consider any grain from that could then potentially become Yashan versus it's still considered Chadash? And that's what I'm really asking.
understood. So if the grain is already growing in the ground and an omer is offered, it becomes, my understanding is that it immediately becomes yashan. And so anything that's harvested after that second day of Pesach that was already growing on that second day of Pesach, meaning the wheat that's going to be harvested several weeks later, that is all already considered yashan. The issue is that if you have um, either something in Adar and you now harvest some grain in Adar, and that grain was planted back in Tishrei or in Cheshvan. Okay, so the grain was, or in Kislev. The bottom line is that it was planted in the fall, and now it is already begun to grow, and it's one of the first crops. So now that's going to be Chadash until the second day of Pesach when the Omer is offered. As
But
soon as
then,
that
then it's considered Yashan.
Exactly. Then it's considered Yashan.
But it has
And
to be
now
in
it
the
will
ground
always be
growing.
Yashan. So a
What?
year later, it'll be Yashan. 2 years later, whenever you eat it, it'll be Yashan.
So what do we consider Chadash then? Let's say if he
So the
plants the
issue in
grain
the
in
United
ER,
States,
if
so
he
the
plants
issue,
it in ER,
yes, if you plant it in ER and now it is ready for harvesting in September in Tishrei, that is going to be Chadash all the way until the next Nisan.
so he
And
can
that is
store it in his house and
you
then
can
bring it to the market in Nissan.
Correct. You can't bring it to the market until Nissan, until the 16th day of Nissan. And that's the issue in the United States. The issue in the United States with respect to Chadash is the fact that there is grain grown that is only planted after after the second day of Pesach. And so we're going to have the second day of Pesach in 2 weeks, in 2 weeks from tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, and yet in Iowa and all those places, they're going to be planting grain at some point shortly thereafter. And that grain is then going to be growing in the summer, and that's the issue of summer. This is my understanding. Again, I'm not a farmer. I don't,
So
but
they
this is my
harvest this in October.
and they harvest it in September and October. And that's the problem. The problem is that in Israel, there's no real issue of Chadash because I don't, at least again, my only understanding of the not no personal experience, but my understanding is no real issue because by anything that is going to be harvested in the grain family is going to have been planted before the second day of Pesach. And so all you're always, the reaping is happening after when it's already chadash, when it's already yashan on the field, because it was already growing sufficiently at the second day of Pesach. But in the United States, you have a whole crop that comes in the fall, and that crop is all going to be chadash all the way. Again, if you hold a chadash
So
outside of Israel.
is that a mitzvah teluya ba'aretz or b'chutz
That
la'aretz?
is an aspect of the question. In general, people say that it is not. The question is do we utilize the Bach's sort of leniency of effectively saying some kind of sex feka in connection with the issue that the sex feka being some kind of like maybe there isn't a mitzvah, maybe it is Tulia Ba'aretz, maybe it's and even if it isn't Tulia Ba'aretz, maybe this isn't Chadash, maybe it's a majority that isn't Chadash, which questions of whether or not that's actually a Sfek Sveka. Anyway, bottom line is that's the reason that because of the questions associated with the box position, that's why many people, especially today, now try to observe Yashan, and it's a lot easier because there are lists of products, and you can just look to see whether the date of the product is sufficient is adequate, and that will tell you whether or not this product when it was produced and whether or not the grain that was used to produce it is currently yashan or not.
How
And
does
so
one know this? Even if there's a date on the bag of bread, you don't necessarily know when the grain was
that's
planted in the
correct.
farmer's
That's correct.
field.
That's correct. That's why they have these lists that tell you that detail. That's exactly right. That's why it's like the UPC code or something along those lines will tell you which batches they do. Which grain that's from. Now again, like the day after the second day of Pesach, you could pretty much be assured that everything in the United States and everything in the world is going to be Yashan because you just passed the second day of Pesach. The only way you end up with Chadash after the second day of Pesach is once you've had enough time to do the planting and the growing and the reaping and the turning it into flour and the turning it into some final product, before the next Omer, before the next second day of
So
Pesach.
that could be October, September,
Yes,
November.
exactly. So when you get to the fall, that's when you begin to be concerned. Again, I'm not an expert on this, and so you should definitely talk to, if you want more details than this, definitely talk to somebody who is an expert on it. But it's a very fascinating topic, and I'm glad that if you stuck around and you're watching this video, I'm glad that you stuck around to enjoy the video. Looking forward to continuing our learning together. Have a wonderful day.